So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming to this, the first talk in the PPE/Ethics Institute speaker series of the semester. We're delighted to have Olufemi O. Taiwo come speak to us today. He is an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University who did his PhD at the University of California at Los Angeles. His theoretical work draws from German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, history of activism, and activist thinkers in the Black radical tradition. I learned he's just finished his book that's in the final stages of publication right now called Reconsidering Reparations, that considers a novel philosophical argument for reparations and explores the links with environmental justice. If his name sounds at all familiar to you or sounded at all familiar to you when you read it on the announcements, it's because he publishes widely in all kinds of high profile public venues, including Slate and Foreign Policy. And in my mind, at least, publishes some of the most interesting contemporary public philosophy, where he really pushes people to think about contemporary issues like climate change from a philosophical perspective, but in a way upending what you would expect to hear or you would expect to come next. So I always find his public writing just terrific. So that's why I'm so happy to have you come speak to us today. So I'll turn it over to you, Professor Taiwo.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the great introduction. Thanks everyone for coming. I smiled when Dr. Prek said the reason why you might know my name is because of public writing, because more often the reason why people have seen my name before is because there's actually a senior philosopher of my same first and last name who is also a Marxist philosopher of African political philosophy. So it's
what are the odds of that?
Small world.
Yeah.
Incredibly small world. What do you know? But that was a much nicer way of saying why people might know my name. So thanks for that. But let me get started. So I want to I'm going to move a little bit quickly just because I want to leave as much room as I can for discussion and not hog up all the time. So what I'm presenting today is called The Constructive View of Reparations. It's adapted from a chapter of the same title from the book that's coming out on reparations. And this book is this chapter is kind of the transition where the book stops giving a sort of history of racial injustice and moves towards its prescriptive proposal, which is this somewhat surprising thing. This claim that I make about reparations. So I say that reparations, for practical, pragmatic reasons, in this day and age, in 2021, in the 21st century, ought to practically orient itself around climate justice. That's not typically what people think of, I think, when they think of reparations for racial justice and colonialism, but here we are. And so that's not a view that I came to all at once. It's a view I sort of came to in stages. And I'm going to do my best to say why it is that I think this is a view of reparations that makes sense. So by this point in the book, just to put some other things on the table that I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, but I'm just gonna have this background for the time being. There's a connection between racial capitalism and environmental justice. Lots has been said about environmental racism. For example, the quote on the left. But I'm taking a very particular analysis of what the connection is between the history of capitalism, racism, empire, and our present moment. And that is what's summarized on the right. So these are claims argued for in the preceding chapters of the book. But my view of global history, and that's, I think, the right way to think of racial capitalism as a theory, is this framework that people call racial capitalism that got worked out by African radical intellectuals in the Dar es Salaam school, as well as Southern Africa, including South Africa, and was popularized in the United States by thinkers like Cedric Robinson and Oliver Cox. But it's a way of telling world history where we take it that the global social structure, that first of all, that there is one. Secondly, that it is the result of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, and that capitalism is itself a result of that larger history. In particular, the way that I understand this history is in distributive terms. So I say, broadly speaking, the system that was created by transatlantic slavery and colonialism is a system in which advantages accumulate towards parts of the world, the global north, and towards populations holding geography fixed, right? So within a country, advantages accumulate towards racially dominant populations. Across countries, advantages accumulate towards global north countries. That second bullet point should say disadvantages, bad things, pollution, toxins, war accumulate in the other direction towards global south, racially disadvantaged. This holds across multiple scales, from the community scale to the international scale. It holds within communities, it holds across communities. Again, happy to talk about any of this in Q&A, but this is just the view that is argued for up until the chapter on the constructive view, which is my positive view of reparations, what I think reparations is about. Again, I think of this in distributive terms. So racial injustice is about how these things are distributed. It's going to include things at the bottom like resources, money, income, wealth that are more classically part of the distributive justice literature, but it's also going to include things like political power and, importantly, security. So housing security, energy security, environmental security, more broadly construed. These are characterized by the same kind of distributive dynamics as other advantages, and they are key to climate justice and to justice in general. So if that's my account of injustice, then my account of justice is likewise distributed, intervening in these inegalitarian distributions that represent the accumulated weight of history and making better ones. So the broad characterization, the target for reparations based on this understanding of the social structure as a planet-sized political structure is this. If transatlantic slavery and colonialism built the racist world order, the proper task of reparations is at that same scale. So to rebuild the world, literally, considering the world as a distribution system. That used to be the kind of prevailing view of racial justice, especially during the 60s and 70s, when the international anti-colonial movement sweeping across Asia and Africa more than tripled the amount of member states in the United Nations. Such was the extent of formal colonialism. This wasn't very long ago, you know, like my parents were born colonial subjects of the British Empire. This is within human lifespans, but we seem to have forgotten this. And, you know, my view is sort of an urge to bring this back. They were literally remaking the world. They were not simply challenging national colonial arrangements. They were challenging multinational institutions, the function of the United Nations. They wanted the international order to be a different thing than the colonial order had built it as. And so I think that's the broad ethos that a view of reparations ought to match. So in the remaining time, I want to kind of characterize the prevailing views of reparations, which I separate into two families. One that's harm repair, that I call harm repair arguments. A second family of arguments I call relationship repair arguments. Then I'll say what my view is by contrast, and then I will pivot from there to saying why that ends up being a climate justice project. So first, some standards. How do we decide which views of reparations are good? One kind of overarching standard is the suggestion that I just made in connection with particular descriptive decisions I've made with respect to global history, right? I understand transatlantic slavery and colonialism as, again, literally constructing the world in terms of thinking of the world as, among other things, a distribution system. And so the proper task of reparations meeting that ethos would be similarly ambitious in size, scope, scale, and import. But I think we can get even more specific about what kind of standards reparations views ought to meet. So first, I think reparations for global racial empire should make tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives, right? The point is not to win, to change hearts and minds, although that may be instrumentally necessary. The point is not to get apologies, although that may be, you know, there may be something in that, but I think I take this to be an overarching concern. Happy to talk about this in Q&A. Secondly, reparations should address the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism. Some take the core moral harms to include the expression of dishonor and lack of dignity. So the first criterion isn't to say that that isn't important, but that it doesn't trump whether or not people have food and water and shelter. And finally, reparations for global racial empire should discriminate. They should distribute benefits and burdens, which should be based on the different relationships of persons and institutions to the core moral wrong. I'm ranking this at the bottom, which is somewhat controversial. Some people think what's maximally important about reparations is that the people who deserve it get it, and the people who deserve to have to pay are forced to pay. I don't treat that as a concern that trumps the others. Again, happy to talk about any of these three, but these are in order of priority. So 1 trumps 2, 2 trumps 3, but they are all expressions of things that are morally important that we might want out of different reparations arguments, desiderata, if you will. So the first category of reparations arguments, harm repair arguments. Reparations should repair present harms to individuals or groups that are caused or even constituted by past harms. So many arguments of this kind are legalistic in nature and strategy. They are often in law reviews. They often model their arguments off of existing kind of legal structures to address harm, like tort law. And they have something of a corporate model of responsibility and liability. So they split groups into something that is supposed to be analogous to a plaintiff and defendant, for example, white Americans and African American descendants of slavery. One set of questions is around whether or not these bifurcations can map onto each other. So is splitting up people into groups of white and black really splitting people up into the same categories as if we asked directly, are people advantaged or disadvantaged by this history, or descended from enslavers and descended from enslaved, given what we know about the endemic nature of sexual violence to slavery. It's not clear that these are the same kinds of distinctions. But I think what's more important is simply to apply the standards. So the first standard, it seems like making tangible difference in the material conditions of people's lives is very much the point, right? It's responding to harm as such. So it's construing present day living conditions of African American descendants of slavery, for example, or Indigenous First Nations people in Canada, for example, as causally downstream of past colonial acts, and tries to address those. So it does well by the first criterion. It's not quite so clear that it does as well by the second. If you take it that the core moral wrong involved expressions of disrespect, or if you take it that the core moral wrong involved things other than negative consequences, it's not clear that, for example, cash checks, as might be the preferred method of intervention on harm repair arguments. It's not clear that those are substantively addressed, even though people are made better off. But it does seem to discriminate. I'm just spotting them that they can address the question about bifurcations that I brought up before. So it does well on 1 and 3, less so on 2. Second category of arguments, relationship repair arguments. On this category, reparations should repair damage to relationships between groups that are caused or constituted by past wrongdoing. There are different ways to run this argument. Maybe the defect in the relationship is like the defect in a debt-creditor relationship when a debt is not paid. So that ends up sounding quite a bit like the harm repair argument. Or perhaps it's more an appeal to concepts of moral repair or the constitution of a moral community, in which case the role for reparations is more symbolic. But either subfamily of running relationship repair arguments is vulnerable, arguably, to this kind of objection from priorities. You could take it from Adolph Reed, who says that reparations distracts from some alternative, preferable political project based around solidarity, or Coleman Hughes, who seems to be responding squarely to the apology view of relationship repairs, and is contrasting that to safer neighborhoods and better schools, the kinds of things that would be preferred on our harm repair view. So the relationship repair doesn't ascribe any intrinsic value into making, or doesn't prefer whatever intrinsic value it gives to making the lives of people who've been affected by slavery and colonialism better off. It is willing to do so, but it treats as primary the communicative value of such acts. So it's actually not about, in the final analysis, making tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives. The question of whether or not it responds to the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism, again, as the harm repair view, depends on what you take the core moral wrongs to be. But if you take them to be in the past, it's not clear in what sense debt repayment or apologies respond to past harms so much as they eliminate the current harms of continued non-payment or continued non-apology. So that would be one way to argue that it fails to meet standard 2. But it does discriminate based on how it conceives of responsibility. Everyone has a role commensurate with their standing in the relationship to the historical harm as a member of the moral community, for example, or as a debtor or as a creditor. So it does seem to do well in who it assigns responsibility to. So those are two families of views. Many views for reparations, especially in recent decades, take more or less one of those two forms. But I'm offering a different one that is more in keeping with the 60s and 70s radical views on racial justice as I understand them, especially by third world and allied global North nation fights for racial justice. So to state the view, it's just this. It's a project to create tomorrow's just world. And if I just said that, it would be hard to see, what's different from reparations and any other ideal theory of the just world, right? Why is that different from the thing Rawls is talking about, or the thing Marx is talking about, or the thing anyone else who's given their picture of what the world should be like is? the constructive view starts by noticing that it matters, or rather by positing, I suppose, that it matters how we get there. And reparations is a proposal about how we get to the just world, which is to distribute the costs of transition from this unjust world to that one in ways that are historically informed in light of yesterday's injustice. So again, this is a constructive view. It's not fixing a thing that happened in the past. It's building a thing that will exist in the future. It's based on distributive justice, not retributive justice. Again, the working understanding of world history is as a world history and the current social structure is as a distribution system. And it revolves around a division of theoretical labor between some considerations that are forward-looking, like the just world, the state of affairs that we want to get to or target, and considerations that are backward-looking, that decide who should take on what burdens and responsibilities to get us from here to the just world. One set of questions to make this more clear is distribution of what? So historically, distributive justice theoreticians have focused on things like income and wealth. In some cases, primary goods. They're meant to be more capacious than income and wealth and include the bases for social dignity and self-respect. I like the view promoted by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum that is called the capabilities approach, which is a fancy way of saying, what are your real opportunities? Not the things that are legal for you to do, but the things that are actually possible given how the world is set up, capaciously understood. So if it's legal for you to enter a house, but you are a wheelchair user and the house doesn't have a ramp, entering that house doesn't seem to be a capability in the right sort of way. So we have to make practical interventions and not just cultural or even legal interventions to change people's capabilities. That's the right flavor of the kind of thing I would like to base the constructive view in. Addressing a supposed tension up front. Some people tell me, why is this a reparations view at all? Again, why is this different from what Marx is talking about, or Rawls, or Nozick, or any of the people who have a view of what the just world is like? Reparations views are supposed to respond to things that have happened in the past, and distributive justice views are about how we distribute stuff that we will, how we distribute a pie that is still baking, for example. So they're forward-looking. There's a lot of theoretical stuff to say here, but to sum it up, just for the sake of moving on, again, happy to say more about this in Q&A. I think this division is artificial and doesn't work. Social structure and our distribution system are the accumulated results of social processes, of stocks and flows. Wealth is something that is built up over time, that is transferred between generations. And the capabilities that people have are the result of the accumulated weight of historical decisions to make investments, to fail to make investments, to build institutions, to fail to build institutions, and so on and so forth. So if we take a snapshot of any day's distribution, we are seeing the accumulated results of that full weight of history. So the distinction between questions about how we should distribute things just is, at bottom, metaphysically speaking, a response about what to do with the accumulated weight of history, and not a question that is sensibly treated as an ahistorical question about accounting between people who have no historical relationships to past actions. Defending a historical distributive justice view is gonna take a bit more than that, obviously, but happy to talk about that. So how well does the constructive view do? It makes tangible differences in the material conditions of people's lives, insofar as our distributive system decides what people's lives are like, decides how much income they have and wealth they have, and practical affordances like ramps or stairs. It addresses the core moral wrongs of transatlantic slavery and colonialism. Again, my characterization of the core moral wrong of transatlantic slavery and colonialism is the construction of the world in this very literal distribution system sense. So on my view, it's the only one of the theories that does succeed on standard 2. Or at least, yeah. And then, my concession is that the constructive view does not do well with respect to number 3, right? If we construct the just world, that's better for everyone, presumably, or at least most people, than the perpetuation of injustice. If we construct bridges, if we beat climate justice, there's going to be something in it, even for the people who are descended from colonizers or the people who occupy racially advantaged categories. And if it's very important to you that reparations treats people entirely categorically differently, this is not the view for you. That is a concession I think I have to make in honesty. So it's not that the constructive view is just in every sense the best view, but my endorsement of this view has a lot to do with these standards as I've laid them out and my arguments for which standards have lexical priority. So I'm very interested in talking about that with you all and dealing with any pushback you might have. But so far, all I've said is about reparations, these abstract questions about which arguments are better than which other arguments. Where's the climate change, right? Where's Sunrise Movement? Where's Bill Gates? I haven't said anything about any of this stuff. Well, it's this simple. The constructive view is a constructive project. That means it directs us to a practical aim, right? The construction of a certain kind of world. And thus it puts us in the world where any kind of practical impediment to the construction of a just world just contingently is relevant to the constructive project. If we were in a different era, if we were in the ecology of the 14th century rather than the 21st century, maybe the proper reparations project would just be something more akin to wealth redistribution, giving checks to the people who are descended from those who were enslaved and colonized. But in this world, the practical impediment between us and achieving justice is climate crisis. What will it profit a parent to be able to send their children to an affordable school that is burned to the ground or underwater? How will it matter whether those checks for tuition clear? How do we protect the gains of yesterday, not even to talk of the gains of tomorrow, from backsliding in a world that's 3 or 4 degrees warmer? That's not just an argumentative or rhetorical ploy. That is the likely result of the continued trajectory of business as usual, climate speaking. Take these 2 topic areas. The climate impacts themselves are not evenly distributed across the globe. People in small island developing states, people on the African continent, people in South Asia are of particular risks of the ecological effects, not to talk of the political ramifications thereof. And as a result, that's going to result in displacement in the hundreds of millions internally with respect to state borders or country borders. And it's going to result in cross-border migratory pressures. And as Dr. Perek could tell you better than I could, we need to be very concerned with what political environment those pressures meet. Do they meet a xenophobic environment that constructs refugees as threats and as undeserving of help and aid, or do they meet justice? Depending on how we do with respect to climate justice, that will be the terrain on which those battles are won and lost. These have, I think, fairly direct implications for racial justice. I'm partial to Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racial justice, which is a bit of a mouthful. She describes it as the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal, that should say, production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death in distinct yet densely connected political geographies. So essentially, there's group-level differences in vulnerabilities to premature death, as she puts it. I would prefer to put it group differentiations in material security. I just find that a little more intuitive based on how my brain is set up. But either way, it's easier for some people to die than other people. And because that is true, because the things you need to survive are inequitably distributed, that is an exploitable fact about our political structures, and it's a produced fact. It's a result of our distributive structures. So it's a clean way of saying, I think, the kind of thing I was saying in the first part of this talk. So if we just guess about how our current inequitable distributions will meet the doubly inequitable distributions of the ecological impacts of climate crisis itself, it's likely that we're going to get a political situation where existing inequalities increasingly wrap themselves around and are defined by different relationships to the changing hierarchy in a climate crisis world. Some people have used the term climate apartheid to describe that. The rich will escape the worst impacts of climate crisis because they will be able to pay to do so, or lobby for the political resources to do so, or whatever causal vector you like, pick your favorite. Climate apartheid and climate colonialism express this basic concept on different scales. So within communities, within countries, we could expect existing social divisions to come to take on climate relevant consequences. And between nations and between indigenous nations and settlers, between states, between parts of the state system, between regions, we can expect the same kind of differentiation. Powerful countries and the powerful communities will insulate themselves from the worst effects of climate crisis at the expense of those who are not the richest, those who are not the most racially advantaged, those who are not in the global north. I use the language of prediction, but I could, I think, just as accurately use the language of observation. So last summer, we saw a connection between climate apartheid and hyperexploitation that is still nascent, but that we could certainly imagine will grow. Thousands of incarcerated people were pressed into service as firefighters in the California wildfires, risking their lives for about $2 a day and the unprecedented perk of getting to visit their children in order to protect houses in California. They do so under neither the protection of minimum wage laws nor the protection of the legal right to unionize. Another way this can look is hyperdisposability, as we saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, where Black people who were looking for food and medicine in the aftermath of the flooding in New Orleans were labeled as looters, and law enforcement officials and white vigilantes alike were afforded de facto impunity to shoot Black people on sight that they deemed criminal. Incarcerated people in particular were ill-treated, left for days in waist-high water, including children as young as 16. So those are the problems. What should we do? I've been spending inordinate amount of time in the kind of practical policy stuff, so I'm just going to give you a clown car of ideas. But I'm very happy and eager to talk about each and all of these. But overall, I think climate reparations is the framework, right? We should get distributive justice in constructive terms. That looks rather like the going framework that multinational institutions claim to use, common but differentiated responsibilities. But it adds the, I think, crucial dimension of the history of the state system itself, rather than simply the history of countries' emissions, and determining which distributions of benefits and burdens from climate policy are just. And above all, I haven't given you a theory of the just world because I don't want to scare off all of my potential friends with the ardentness of my commie nature. But we could at least agree, I hope, that meaningful governance of people about their own lives, self-determination, should be a principle of climate policy and all policy that we can agree upon. And those combinations should help us decide what we do at the concrete policy level. At the concrete policy level, I would love to see comprehensive reform of country level immigration policies in the direction of a return to more wide use of resettlement rather than the current warehousing model. I would love to see community control over police. That's its own bag of worms, but happy to talk about that. I'd love to see real commitments to the Green Climate Fund, which is a funding vehicle by which the developed world was supposed to contribute to the green pathway, to making possible green pathways of development for the developing world. But the target set for the Green Climate Fund was an order of magnitude too small, and the actual commitments by rich nations have been several orders of magnitude less than the target, which was already too small. So I think getting serious about that will go a long way. Part of getting serious about that is dealing with tax havens and the ongoing shameless plunder of the entire world by the multinational elite. By the best available estimate, and this is a somewhat old estimate, it's a 2007 estimate, as much as 10% of global GDP, so gross world product, is hidden in offshore tax havens of this or that kind. If those resources were put to public use rather than building super yachts to park your smaller yachts in, I think we'd have a better likelihood of climate justice. And in all of these more granular questions about how to distribute research burden for new clean energy technologies, how to distribute insurance burden for loss and damage, who should be taking up the burden of carbon removal. I think it's far and away that the global north should be taking that up. How we should deal with debt, particularly the debt of developed nations. We should answer all those questions with an eye towards interrupting the colonial distributions of wealth and advantages that characterize the current system. So we should, as much as we can, push those distributions in the direction of justice. How can we do that? I'll say one thing that exists outside the formal systems of country and multinational decision making, and one that could be built into it. So bargaining for the common good is a model of organized labor bargaining, where community organizations and activists help decide what workers' demands will be and help prosecute the struggles for them. So that means that labor unions would be bargaining over more than just wages and benefits, but also public policy and other aspects of justice. An SEIU local in Minnesota already tried this out in what Labor Notes called the first climate strike, where they struck for better wages, better sick pay, and greener cleaning materials, and won all of the above. So I think that model, massively upscaled, could put pressure on capital and the state alike to distribute in the direction of justice. And finally, community control. It's no accident that countries and multinational institutions and corporations make the decisions that they do. They make the decisions that are in the best interests of them and their shareholders and the people that pay the lobbyists. The more that we can move decision making to the level of the people who have the most rather than the least at stake, the more we can interrupt these racist colonial distributions of vulnerability and material security. So that is how we get from reparations to a view of climate justice. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking about it with you.
Thank you so much for that. Such bold, interesting approach to this topic. So as people are gathering their thoughts, you can put questions in the chat, you could put your hand up, or you can write RTS request to speak in the chat, and then I'll call on you kind of as things come up. As people are gathering their thoughts, though, I completely forgot that before Professor Taiwo started to speak, I meant to introduce MAP, Minorities in Philosophy, who are going to be meeting with Professor Taiwo right after the session today at around 6 o'clock when we finish up. So Lauren, who was here, I believe, was going to just briefly introduce the group. Lauren, would you like to jump in?
Oh, yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Lauren. I'm the director of the outreach at the Northeastern chapter of Minorities in Philosophy. And so basically what we do, we center and emphasize philosophers and philosophical texts of marginalized communities. So that could be anything from race, gender, sexuality, disability, and more. We have bi-weekly meetings every Thursday at 6 p.m. And we run on a semesterly theme. So this one is about imagining kind of like a post-society or a futurism. And like Professor Perrick said, we will have the honor of hosting Professor Taiwo at our meeting this evening at 6 p.m. So if you guys want to follow us on Instagram at map_Northeastern and sign up for our mailing list, I can also probably put it in the chat if you're interested. But yeah, we hope to see you there.
Yeah, that would be great if you could put that in the chat. And then if you have, do you have a different link for the meeting, or are you just staying on this link?
Yeah, I think we have a different link for the meeting, so I could put that in the chat as well.
Perfect. So everyone is welcome. It's very inclusive, and everyone's very, very warmly encouraged to come to the MAP meetings, or at least sign up for their emails and so forth. And thanks to Professor Taiwo for taking the time to meet with them. So Candice has the first question, and please feel free to jump in.
Thanks, Professor Taiwo. Thanks so much for joining us, and I really loved the talk. So, I have a question about the kind of strategy of presenting this bold climate plan as a reparations plan. And so, I mean, I don't know how it would pan out in the global context, but in the local, national, American context, backward-looking arguments are seen, and reparation programs are seen as a kind of threat to white identity and self-image. And they've had, I mean, they're necessary, but strategically, they seem to not be, you know, welcome, even thoughts to entertain. And so I guess that's just the kind of strategic question I wanted to ask you, like whether, I mean, I see the ways in which it's both a backward-looking and a forward-looking argument, but it seems that you could make the argument as a simply forward-looking argument and get the exact same results. And so I wonder why, whether it's wise, practically speaking, to keep the backward-looking part. And given, you know, that it doesn't meet the standard 3, it looks much less like a reparations program, maybe in good ways.
No, that's a really good point. And I go back and forth on this myself. You know, I would say every other day I wake up and think, my God, I've designed the exact worst of both worlds views to make everyone angry. All the reparations people and all the climate people will be like, you have taken one of the most controversial things and somehow made it about one of the other most controversial things. How dare you? And I think today I wake up and I think you're just correct, right? So I can't appeal to strategy to, at least today, maybe tomorrow I can. But today I think you're right. I don't think strategically, I don't think strategy is the upshot of this view of climate reparations. What I think the upshot of this view of reparations is, and I guess in a way it kind of indirectly feeds back into strategy, is a kind of check against mission creep, and something I would, you know, maybe also describe as elite capture. But like, look, if we're just thinking, can we win this political program, then yeah, calling it climate reparations isn't going to help us win this political program. But I think we're at a more basic political level, which is this even the view of, is this even the practical program that we're going to fight to win at all? And I think it's in that respect that I'm most confident about the reparations view, you know, or about this view of reparations. You know, like, I think the people, it is my perception of the people who are of the more dominant views of reparations today, that there isn't a kind of long-term reckoning with the kinds of political problems that climate crisis is going to bring up, that they can't get a purchase on from a purely backward-looking perspective, right? And so from that point of view, the purpose of this view of reparations is to say, hey, everyone needs to adopt, everyone who believes in reparations and racial justice needs to adopt this kind of perspective on climate justice. And once we've done that, then we can figure out what to call it to make sure that people that hate racial justice will also get on board. But I'm at that more basic level, I think.
Thank you, Jenny.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your talk, and I look forward to reading your book. I had a couple of questions, and I guess they're kind of, you know, testing out some practical policy relevant things that are happening right now with your ideas here. And one is, you know, with energy justice, you mentioned co-ownership, and kind of this idea of energy democracy is something that I've written a lot about. And energy justice, we have one of our colleagues here at Northeastern just got appointed under the Biden-Harris administration to be Deputy Director of Energy Justice in the Department of Energy. And she's going to be Professor Shalonda Baker, and she's going to be responsible for this 40%. They've come up with a commitment that 40% of all investments will go to marginalized communities, underinvested in communities in their climate and energy investments. So I was curious, kind of your thoughts on that and how that fits this kind of idea of a practical approach of starting to do some of what you're talking about, I guess. And then the other question I had is on another climate strategy that you didn't explicitly mention, but you did mention carbon removal technologies and saying that northern countries, should take on that responsibility of trying to reduce, take out the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And I'm also involved in discussions about solar geoengineering, which is this idea of injecting aerosols into the atmosphere to actually cool the temperature of the Earth. And I've written about that and critical of that approach because for a lot of reasons. But I'm curious again, because it cuts into this kind of imperialism, that a social justice perspective has been used to justify why we should do this, because by cooling the whole Earth, like the vulnerable people of the Earth will be less vulnerable because some of the temperatures won't be as extreme or something like that. But it's so anyway, I was just curious if you had thought about that at all, or if that is in your writings. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for both those questions. So let me respond in order. So the 40% of frontline communities plan, how should I put this? It's compatible with the view of reparations as I think of it, right? It's a fairly good example of the kind of thing, actually, right? So that's the kind of thing I'm broadly in favor of. The devil is a little bit in the details, right? We want to make sure the distributions actually go that way. There are some ways of identifying communities by census tract, which and there are some ways of identifying communities by zip code. And depending on the granularity with which we do this, it will succeed or fail distributively. But the idea in general is something I support. I think it's, it's a good example of what this looks like in concrete terms. As for solar geoengineering, I think this is something I've thought about a lot in terms of the debates about moral hazard, and people make similar arguments about solar radiation management and carbon removal, or sometimes they'll lean on the distinction between nature-based solutions and tech-based solutions. And I think people are right to look at the kind of status quo state of play in terms of which political actors are supporting what. Like that is wise, right? That certainly contributes to how we should answer those questions. But those questions are ultimately empirical, and they're not empirical in the like apolitical sense of, well, we just need to figure out what the sulfur is going to do when it's in the atmosphere. Like what we need to figure out is which political coalitions can win the relevant governance and political contextual battles that will decide how those technologies function. If we're doing carbon removal by investing in enhanced oil recovery technology so that fossil fuel companies can get more fossil fuel, and if they are unilaterally deciding the course of research, development, and deployment of those technologies in ways that respond to the lies they tell their shareholders as opposed to goals for the world, that's bad. If we instead, grow a shitload of kelp and, achieve co-benefits of ocean alkalinization and do so in a way that's meaningfully community directed, that seems good. And people, I think the mistake is trying to answer those situational questions as if they adhere into the technology vehicle as opposed to the political context itself. Like, that's a question about what the regulators are doing and what the political parties are doing and what the governance structures are and the battles that are won and lost on those terrains. And you just can't answer them by saying like this tech is bad and you know, afforestation is good, you know, without looking at the land use problems of afforestation or the alternative governance structures of potential tech use. Like, it's all contingencies all the way down.
Great. Thank you.
So I'd really like to encourage our undergraduates to ask questions. We've had a couple of professors ask questions at a very high level, but please, you know, put your hands up or write RTS or write questions in the chat, even if it's, you know, you might be thinking, oh, I have a more basic question or it's connected to a different class or something like that, but we'd really, really like to hear from you. I know I have a couple of people in line, but just a shout out and encouragement to everyone. Cooper, please.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for your talk. I thought that was really great. My question is in regard to on the constructive view of reparations, do you assign a level or a primary level of agency for the obligations and responsibilities of the project? And by that, I mean, like, is it primarily obligations of state or obligations of individuals or individuals as constituents of certain other groups? And also, I guess, a follow-up that may or may not be relevant based on your responses, if the constructive view might entail the abolishment of some of those institutions that we might want to assign obligations to in our current system, would that just be a mark of success, or would that be kind of a problem for down the road once that happens?
Both somehow. It's really insightful question. Okay, let me circle back to the first question, then come back to the second. So I actually don't at all explain the constructive view in terms of obligations, precisely because of the complications that you're pushing on right here, right? I think, you know, people may have or may not have heard the term realpolitik, or realism. I don't. That's not like a thorough description of how I think, but I am more in that direction than I think a lot of justice literature. I think there's altogether too much moralizing about which institutions and which things are like categorically good or bad, and not enough thinking about how we're going to actually get the world to be at least less genocidal than it's heading towards. So entirely my view is in terms of targets. And so it is just a strategic question of what combination of levers will get us from here to there. And it's partly because one of the things that I kind of semi-bracket is the question of what the just world is. So maybe the just world is a world without borders, right? Maybe the just world is a world without the state system at all. Maybe it's one world government. Maybe it's something more like, you know, revolutionary intercommunalism. You know, there are interminable debates that we could have there. But I take it the current trajectory of climate crisis is not on anybody's version of the just world. And so one thing that we can coherently have practical unity on, even in the absence of a more thorough ideological unity, is trying to avoid, you know, migration triggered genocide, is trying to avoid these like deeply, you know, trying to avoid the destruction of small island states, the existential crisis they face, right? And so I want to try to keep it, at least for the purposes of this book, in this strategic space because of the complications you're pointing out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cooper. Edith.
Hi, I wanted to also say thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting and very, I guess it has a lot to do with stuff that I'm researching now and everyone in my class is researching, so that's really cool. I had two questions, maybe they're really the same question. You mentioned early on in the talk about a new sort of world order, and I was wondering how the sort of constructivist model of distribution like fits into that specifically, and maybe just like expand on it a little bit, because I feel like I'm having a hard time like thinking about it on like a not on like such a broad level, as opposed to like solving like institutional like harms within states. And that kind of features into my next part of my question, which is how do like international institutions fit into this, like things like the UN and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, these are, you know, the kind of really tough sort of meta practical questions, you know. I think for me, a basic thing that I think about is material security, right? So food security, housing security, energy security, water security. You know, we could just start off with those four. And we could look throughout the world and be like, who has all four of those kinds of security? You might think, you know, you can't really have substantive freedom unless you have at least those four and hopefully some other stuff, right? Hopefully stuff like political rights, that would be nice, right? But you need at least those four, because if you don't have them, you will die. And so we could just, you know, we could ask a very specific, very concrete question, like where are the places and where are the populations that have this kind of security, and what levels of wealth and what levels of other kinds of and technology transfer and other kinds of transfers will be required to get that to be experienced by everyone, right? Everyone to have those kinds of basic forms of security. And so I think there's a complicated question about the role that institutions play in this, right? Because I think one of the biggest barriers to universal security of those kinds is built into the state system itself, which we rarely think of as such, right? We're like, well, what's the Democratic Republic of Congo's policies? You know, what laws did they pass? When, you know, the question that you would really want to ask if you wanted to figure out what was going on in the Congo is, you know, what internal regulations Microsoft passed, given that the eastern region of the country is dominated by mining for the minerals that they use to make their gadgets, right? And there's no institution that has the size, scope, and legitimacy to regulate those kinds of cross-border planetary scoping transactions and supply chains that actually decide for much of the people on this earth what opportunities they do or do not have. And so I think maybe as a short and medium term kind of answer to your question, the most basic thing that international institutions do, the most basic role that they need to have is creating the possibility of doing something about those kinds of transnational planetary scoping, you know, economic aspects of our system, right? There isn't a international body that can levy its global tax on carbon or on capital, right? Maybe the institutions should change so that that becomes possible, right? There's all this intermediate stuff between here and, you know, the one world government or whatever that people talk about sometimes. You know, maybe that is what we need, but we can talk in much smaller chunks than that. Like we don't even, right now, we don't even track capital globally. We have the information databases necessary for a body to do it, but no body has been given that responsibility. If whoever, the WTO, the International Monetary Fund, if they were to get that responsibility, you know, then we might be able to circle back to that conversation about who has what kinds of security in a meaningful way.
So Aiden has a question in the chat, and I'll read it and maybe piggyback on it a little bit of the question that I had. So Aiden was wondering if you could elaborate on the subject of responsibility a little bit more. He said that you mentioned that it's not about a country's emissions, but about the state systems that govern them. And I was wondering something similar. You know, a lot of the discussion in global justice around climate change is like, how do you ground an obligation to, you know, address climate change, to mitigate it, to decarbonize? And when I think about your view in relation to these, you know, the polluter pays or the emissions view or the beneficiary pays perspectives, it seems like it's sort of a past emissions approach. Like, so although it's not just emissions, you're talking about a larger set of policies that resulted in the global world today. But a criticism of those views is that it kind of lets off the hook non-colonial countries, but who are nonetheless big polluters. And you know, China and India being the two big examples. And so I wonder how your account sort of deals with that problem. So on the one hand, you know, Europe, Canada, the US, like we're on the hook for going forward to make the world a more just place. But other countries that might have the capacity, that are currently emitting a lot, even if they didn't historically, and may even have the resources to actually address climate change in some way, don't seem to have the impetus to be part of this plan.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's in some ways the hardest question for my view to answer. Well, it's the hardest for my view to answer rhetorically, because then I have to admit some stuff that I don't want to admit. But you know,
Well,
it's
that's
honesty
intriguing.
time. Yeah. So, you know, one of the major departures that my view makes in general on the issue of responsibility is that it kind of punts. So there's a point in the book where I say, well, the concept that we really need is liability. Because you actually, yeah. Liability is just on the hook for the costs of something, essentially. Sometimes that can happen without fault finding, for example, in what legal theorists call strict liability, so on and so forth. And we want liability partially because I just think the kind of responsibility story in a way that's going to be true at all scales is pretty hopeless. It's really easy to say why the United States has a responsibility as an institution. It's really hard to tell the same story about why the US has responsibility as to why, say, white Americans have a responsibility to their African American neighbors. Right? There are actually very few stories about both of those things that are coherent. And in fact, there's actually very few stories about either of those things that are individually coherent. You know, I alluded to this earlier when I talked about the harm repair view and how they try to split people into racially advantaged populations and racially disadvantaged populations, and then the populations that were made better off by racism and the populations that were made worse off by racism, and pretends that that's the same split. And you really can't tell that story coherently, right? So if I buy my own analysis that racial capitalism is the story of the construction of the world, not of racial disparities in the world, but the world itself, then we are all, in the causal sense, beneficiaries of one degree or other. And the extent to which we're beneficiaries are actually much better tracked by things like wealth than by racial classification. Right. So I mean, you can see why some people would not like that way of talking, right? Who are committed to more orthodox views on who should pay reparations and who should receive. And so I just kind of try to background it. But I really can't when people ask me the question that you asked me, right? So why is it that China, how much should China pay and how much should the Gulf states pay, given that in the kind of historical sense, they're the global South, but they're also, from a scope 3 perception, huge emitters, and et cetera, et cetera. And the thing, the thing that I think is true, that I will just come clean about, is that I think, ability to pay is going to, the causal story of why a country is rich goes through this larger history of racial colonialism. And it's just not going to line up perfectly with, the moral responsibility is not going to line up perfectly with like what the liability should be based on how wealthy these countries are, right? Like if we really wanted to break it down into historical responsibility, we'd be footing the bill to Spain and Portugal, which, I mean, they're developed European economies, but they're not, they're not big deals from a GDP perspective in the way that the US is, or even the UK. But historically speaking, that's the flag Christopher Columbus was waving, or Vasco da Gama, right? So, as soon as so I think liability is the story, and it's going to look quite like, it's going to look a lot more like progressive taxation than the typical story that people tell of who's on the hook for reparations.
Really interesting. Thank you. Justin.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the talk. I guess my question is somewhat related to previous questions regarding the practicality and sort of the political roadmap to achieve climate reparations. I guess my first question primarily was about how to introduce and garner public support for such climate reparations, especially given that, like you said, both subjects sort of incite a lot of political polarization. Some people are very for it, some people are very against it. And in addition to that, how can we expect any sort of legislative change to happen when the vehicle for that legislative change would be those individuals like Mitch McConnell, who denies all responsibility of the current population for any sort of reparations for the African American population in the United States today, and also in the same chambers where someone waves around a snowball saying that this is proof that climate change doesn't exist. So in such a political context where there's a sense of purposeful ignorance, where do we start to even begin to approach legitimate ways of actual legislative change or public support, wherever the case may be? Does it start with education? Does it start with grassroots movements? Does it have to be sort of a huge event for something, for media support to happen? Just I was just curious in terms of the practicality and the steps that need to be taken.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I actually, it's interesting. I've been asked a version of this question a handful of times, and more times than not, people use Mitch McConnell's name specifically, which is interesting. But I mean, he's a good example of this, right? And I give the same answer every time. Or like, someone says, how would you argue for this view of reparations to someone like Mitch McConnell? And I just say I wouldn't, right? So the theory of change here is a kind of two-stage thing, right? One, we preach to the choir. The people who are amenable to thinking about racial justice, who are open to that kind of thinking. We're like, hey, here's a view of racial justice that makes really good sense out of this particular climate project, right? Let's fund the Green Climate Fund. Let's get the tax havens. Let's do transfers from north to south. Let's get on board with doing all that stuff. And then, you know, once the choir has been preached to and everybody's got religion, then we say, all right, what do we do about all these other people that are not in the choir, right? And then we might have to get crafty. Like, you know, there's a reason why the, you know, there's a reason why organized workers is a kind of, you know, like labor unions is a sensible method for this, not because labor unions are magical places of perfect politics where nobody thinks anything problematic, but just because, you know, when Mitch McConnell says, no, I don't want to do your climate project, labor, and I'm not gonna because I have the power, labor unions can answer that kind of person back in a language that they understand, which is not telling them that they're being racially problematic, but is telling them that, hey, nothing's going to work because we're all going to go on general strike until you get your act together, right? So it's about finding the kinds of institutions and the kinds of political networks that have, you know, kind of coercive leverage of a certain kind, and building those power networks out. And I think that's going to have to be the strategy. So there are a few things that can do both, that can play both of those roles, right? That can rally the troops and that can speak to the outgroup. I think those are different political missions, and they're both important, and you have to do both, but you can rarely do them both at the same time.
Thank you. Lauren.
Okay. I was going to ask about the whether you think it would be more successful. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the movement of American descendants of slavery, which is like a political movement about reparations for obviously the American descendants of slavery, specifically like in the US. I was wondering if you felt like with their objectives would be strengthened by a framework, or could make use of the framework that you've presented, the constructive view for climate reparations, if maybe like the opposition to people of the ADOS movement would not see this as like as futile as they probably do, given that their current position is a little more centered on like legislation and monetary distribution to set up American Black people with socioeconomic like advantages. I was just wondering if, first of all, if that question made sense. I can rephrase it, but what your thoughts were on that.
Do I think that they could use the constructive view?
Yeah, and do you think they could benefit from having a more constructive view, or having like a larger theoretical framework outside of just the one that they're kind of using now?
Yes and yes. So I think they like, it would just be strange to me to deny their core claim, right? It's just true that the United States, that the creation of the United States from start to finish involved a very particular world historically, you know, world historically bad and enduring kind of apartheid and domination that included slavery and 1,000 other things. And so it would be strange to me for someone to say that, like, if you're thinking about the United States, that it doesn't have a particular obligation to African American descendants of slavery. I don't even know how a denial of that would go, other than Mitch McConnell, right? But I think to kind of stay in the United States framework, to only think about the United States as a country and to only think about kind of the causal imprint of the United States is to tell a, I think, reductive view of what it was that happened here, or to have a reductive view or to develop a reductive view of what happened here. In 1619, this part of the world was a colony of the British Empire. And well through the 19th century, slavery was largely organized around the presentation of raw materials to the manufacturing centers of Lancashire and Liverpool and Manchester to produce goods to be sold in the colonially exposed markets of West Africa and South Asia. There's just there isn't a way of, you know, even now, if we're trying to understand much more recent phenomena, mass incarceration against the geopolitical backdrop of the Cold War, which was a global struggle, deindustrialization, which involved the offshoring of job centers that were important to African American communities to whole other countries. There just isn't a way of making sense of the African American experience in isolation from the rest of the world, for the same reason that there isn't a way of making out anyone else's political situation in isolation from the rest of the world. Like, what this is a world order, a global distribution system. And so I think, if nothing else, the constructive view adds that. But I also think, maybe more pragmatically and less in kind of ideological terms, I think the constructive view would be good for that movement in the way that it directs attention to the practical exigencies of trying to accomplish something tomorrow. And that means contending with the political conditions of tomorrow. Right? It just doesn't seem to me that, or, you know, if it's going on in that movement, I'm unaware of it, but it doesn't seem to me like there's a strong contention about what great power competition is going to mean for African American descendants of slavery, or what the housing market under conditions of climate crisis and enduring racial discrimination will look like for African Americans, or how policing will morph in terms of what it will do for African Americans. So I would hope that the constructive view would help in that sense, but, you know, spitballing to some extent.
So we have about 5 minutes left and 2 more questions in the chat. So I wonder if we could take both questions and then you could respond to both of them and wrap up as you see fit. So Richard and then Brittany.
Hi, good evening. Thank you. Quick question. So I'm actually from South Africa, so that word apartheid rings nice and well. So with a different, you know, kind of political system there, with different focuses, how do you recommend a country or a political system like South Africa, or like South Africa has, would go about adopting something like this when there's either a huge debate in terms of the corruption that happens within the political system, or when the political system's focus is solely on one thing, which might just be redistribution of wealth? You know, when like a country like South Africa isn't held to the same accountability as like the United States government, for example, or might not have the size or the resources to focus on multiple things. What would your approach be to that?
And Brittany, do you want to jump in with your question?
Yeah, so Lauren actually asked my question because I was also interested in like what people in the US think of what African Americans think about this. But I also do have a question. I'm not sure if you answered it, but you talked about it's more important to focus on the material conditions rather than getting everybody on board for the fight of climate reparations. I wanted to know why you thought that was true. Like, how come the material conditions is more important than the ideology, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask.
Let me go in order. So or order they were asked. So yeah, South Africa is a tough case. I suspect there would be, I think in the case of either state corruption or lack of state capacity, and certainly in the case of both, I think, you know, those are reasons that call for a focus on politics outside of state and party politics. There's a strong trade union movement there. It's got its own issues, but that might be the way to move things forward in that context. And to respond to Brittany's question, so yeah, the ideology versus material is, you know, a huge and important debate. I guess the quickest thing that I can say is I don't believe people sometimes, right? You know, I've read the Bible, I've read descriptions of slavery, and I'm just like, okay, if you were a Christian and you genuinely, in whatever sense of genuine, were spotting people, believed in what Jesus told you to do, and you were also part of a system of chattel slavery, it must be that what you believe is not the explanation of social reality in the way that other kinds of incentives are. And obviously there's a huge, long debate that people have around this issue, but that's like the quick thing that I would say to say my position on it. Yeah.
Wonderful. So before we wrap up, two quick things. So my class, we will meet back at the usual Zoom link at 6:15. And those of you who'd like to go to the map meeting after, which I encourage everyone here to go to, the link is in the chat, but Lauren, maybe you could just post it again at the very bottom so people can just click straight to that. I don't know, Femi, if you want to take a break and stretch your legs a little bit before you go, feel free. So other than that, please join me in thanking Professor Taiwo for just a really interesting, thought-provoking, challenging, all of the things that scholarship should be kind of talk. And thanks for being here tonight. It's been really great having me. Everyone. Okay, great. So the link to map is in the chat. Professor Taiwo, do you have it?
Yeah, I have. I copied the link from the chat. So
okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Feel free to email me if you can't find it for some reason. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone who's come, and we'll see everyone at the next talk in a few weeks, I hope.